The backstage area of the Viper Room smelled like old leather and cigarette smoke that had soaked into the walls over decades. Tommy Rivera moved through the dimly lit space with practiced ease, his worn toolbox in one hand and a guitar case in the other. 15 years in this business had taught him to become invisible, and he'd gotten good at it. Really good. Tonight was another private showcase. These events happened once or twice a month, always the same drill. Some big shot with a record label would rent out the venue, invite a bunch of hungry musicians desperate for their big break, and spend 3 hours crushing dreams with bored expressions and dismissive hand waves. Tommy had seen it all before, countless times. He set down his toolbox near the amplifier rack and checked his watch. The first act would start in 20 minutes, which gave him just enough time to make sure everything was perfect. That's what people paid him for. Not to be seen, not to be heard, just to make sure the equipment worked flawlessly so the real stars could shine. The guitar in his hands was a beautiful instrument, a vintage Stratocaster that probably cost more than his car. He ran his fingers along the neck, checking the action, making tiny adjustments to the bridge. His calloused fingertips knew every millimeter of this process. Tune the low E string, check the intonation, move to the A string, repeat. It was meditation, really. The only time his mind went quiet. People started filtering into the venue. Industry types in expensive jackets, young musicians clutching instrument cases like lifelines, and the usual crowd of hangers-on who seemed to materialize at these events. Tommy kept working, his head down, his focus on the task at hand. A few people nearly bumped into him as they walked past. Nobody apologized. Nobody even seemed to notice he existed. That was fine. He'd made peace with it years ago, or at least that's what he told himself. The headliner arrived 20 minutes late, which was apparently early for someone of his status. Derek Stone, everyone knew the name. 3 platinum albums, 2 Grammy nominations, and a reputation for discovering fresh talent. His label, Apex Records, had launched a dozen careers over the past decade. Derek was the kind of guy who could change your life with a single phone call. He was also, from what Tommy had observed over the years, kind of insufferable. Derek swept into the room surrounded by his entourage. 5 or 6 people who laughed at everything he said, agreed with every opinion, and generally treated him like he was already a legend instead of just a successful musician who'd gotten lucky with good timing and better connections. He dropped into a leather chair near the stage, boots up on a table, a glass of bourbon already in his hand despite it being only 7 in the evening. Tommy finished with the Stratocaster and moved on to the acoustic guitar. A young woman was going to open the showcase, some folk singer from Portland. She'd arrived early, nervous energy radiating off her like heat from pavement in summer. Tommy had given her an encouraging nod when she'd asked if the mic was working. She'd smiled, grateful for even that small kindness. The showcase began. The folk singer was actually pretty good. Her voice clear and emotional, her lyrics honest. She made it through exactly 1 verse and half a chorus before Derek waved his hand dismissively. "Next," he called out, not even looking up from his phone. The girl's face fell. She unplugged her guitar with shaking hands and walked off stage. Tommy caught her eye as she passed and saw tears threatening to spill. He knew that look. He'd worn it himself once, a long time ago. 5 more acts followed. A rock band that was too polished. A rapper who was too raw. A jazz fusion group that was too weird. A pop singer who was too conventional. And a blues guitarist who was apparently too old. Derek found something wrong with each of them, barely letting anyone finish a complete song. His entourage laughed and nodded along with each rejection, like this was the most entertaining thing they'd seen all week. Tommy kept busy adjusting equipment between acts, swapping out guitars, tweaking the soundboard levels. He'd learned to tune out the cruelty of these events. It wasn't his place to judge, wasn't his place to feel anything about it. He was just there to make sure the technical side ran smoothly. But something about tonight felt different. Maybe it was the folk singer's devastated expression. Maybe it was Derek's particularly nasty comment to the jazz group about how their music belonged in an elevator, not on a stage. Maybe it was just 15 years of watching this same scene play out over and over. The talented being dismissed, the connected being celebrated, and skill taking a backseat to image every single time. The last scheduled act finished and left. The room fell into an awkward silence. Derek took a long drink of bourbon and looked around like he was disappointed in everyone for wasting his time. His eyes swept across the stage area, past the sound equipment, past the lighting rig, and landed on Tommy. "Hey," Derek called out. Tech guy. Come here for a second. Tommy looked up, surprised. In 15 years, he couldn't remember a single time one of these showcase headliners had directly addressed him. He was furniture. Part of the background. He set down the cable he was coiling and walked toward the seating area, keeping his expression neutral. You've been doing this a while, right? Derek asked, gesturing vaguely with his glass. I've seen you at, 3 or 4 of these things? About that, Tommy replied. His voice sounded strange to his own ears. He didn't speak much at these events. Derek leaned back in his chair, a smirk forming on his face. His friends were already starting to grin, sensing some kind of joke forming. So you're around guitars all the time? Setting them up, tuning them, fixing them. He paused for effect. But I bet you can't actually play, can you? Tommy felt his jaw tighten slightly. He didn't respond, just held Derek's gaze steadily. Come on. Derek continued, warming to his theme. His voice got louder, playing to his audience. Bet you've been around musicians for years, watching, learning, thinking maybe you could do it. But there's a difference between knowing how a guitar works and actually making music, you know what I mean? The entourage laughed right on cue. One of them, a guy in an expensive leather jacket, added, Yeah, like being a car mechanic doesn't make you a race car driver. More laughter. Derek was clearly enjoying himself now. Tell you what, Derek said, leaning forward with that smirk still plastered on his face. I'm feeling generous tonight. Go grab one of those guitars. Play one chord for me, just one. And if it impresses me, if you show me you've got even a spark of real talent, I'll sign you to my label right now, tonight. We'll draw up a contract. And you can stop being the guy who tunes guitars for real musicians. The room went quiet except for a few snickers from his crew. They all thought it was hilarious. The idea that the equipment guy might have actual talent. That someone who'd spent 15 years in the shadows might deserve to step into the light. Tommy stood there for a long moment, his hands at his sides. Every eye in the room was on him now, waiting to see if he'd walk away embarrassed or accept what they all clearly thought was a joke at his expense. Something shifted inside him then. Something that had been pressed down and locked away for 15 years. It wasn't anger exactly. It was more like a door opening. And on the other side was every dream he'd told himself to forget. Every piece of music he'd written but never shared. Every moment he'd hidden his talent because it felt safer than risking rejection. He looked at Derek Stone, with his smug expression and his expensive bourbon and his friends who'd never worked for anything real in their lives. Then, Tommy walked toward the center of the stage and picked up the Stratocaster he'd spent 3 hours preparing. The weight of the guitar strap settled across Tommy's shoulder like it belonged there. And it did, really. He'd held thousands of guitars over the years, but rarely like this. Not center stage. Not with dozens of eyes watching him, waiting for him to embarrass himself so they could all have a good laugh. He glanced down at the Stratocaster. The stage lights caught the glossy finish, making it gleam. His fingers found their positions on the neck without him having to think about it. Muscle memory from countless late nights in his tiny apartment, playing for an audience of none. Derek was still smirking from his chair, bourbon glass raised like he was about to toast the world's most predictable punchline. His friends had their phones out already, probably ready to capture the moment for social media. Look at this guitar tech who thought he could play. Look at this nobody who forgot his place. Tommy closed his eyes and took a breath. Just one breath, pulling the stale backstage air into his lungs and letting it out slowly. In that moment of darkness, he made a choice. He could play it safe, strum a basic chord, let them laugh and go back to being invisible, or he could stop hiding. 15 years, that's how long he'd been hiding. His fingers moved. What came out wasn't a single chord. It was a cascade of notes that seemed to tumble over each other like water over rocks, each one crystal clear and precise. His right hand danced across the strings, tapping out a melody that shouldn't have been possible with 10 fingers. His left hand shaped notes, bent them, made them cry and sing and whisper secrets. The technique was called finger tapping, something most guitarists struggled with for years before getting it right. Tommy made it look effortless, like breathing. The melody started soft, almost delicate, like the first drops of rain. Then it built, layer upon layer, his fingers finding harmonies that transformed the single guitar into what sounded like 3 instruments playing together. Derek's smirk had frozen on his face. His glass stopped halfway to his lips. Tommy shifted into something different, his fingers now sliding into a blues progression that bent notes in ways that made them sound almost vocal. He'd learned this from an old session player he'd worked with years ago, a guy who'd played with legends back in the 70s. The man had taught Tommy that blues wasn't about the notes you played, it was about the notes you almost played, the ones that hung in the air between the beats. Someone in the audience gasped. Tommy heard it even through his closed eyes, even through the music that was pouring out of him like he'd been holding it back behind a dam for his entire adult life. The melody shifted again. Now it was aggressive, urgent. His fingers flew across the fretboard in patterns he'd practiced 10,000 times in private, never thinking anyone would hear them. This was the kind of playing that took years to master, the kind of technical skill that separated weekend hobbyists from real musicians. Speed runs up the neck, harmonics that rang out like bells, palm muting that created percussion against the strings. But it wasn't just technical. That was the thing. Plenty of people could play fast. Plenty of people could nail the difficult techniques. What made this different was the feeling behind it. Every note carried weight. Every phrase told a story. The story of a 17-year-old kid who'd saved up for 2 years to buy his first real guitar, only to watch his father get sick and have to sell it to help pay medical bills. The story of college applications to music schools that went unfinished because there was no money for tuition. The story of working 3 jobs while trying to keep his dream alive. Practicing in the early morning hours before the sun came up because that was the only time he had. Tommy's fingers found a gentler melody now, something that ached. This part was about the demo tape. He'd spent 6 months recording it in his friend's basement studio, mixing and remixing until every note was perfect. He'd sent it to 43 record labels. Not one had responded. Not one. A woman in Derek's entourage had tears running down her face. She wasn't even trying to hide them. The guy in the sound booth had stood up from his chair, his hand pressed against the glass window, his mouth hanging open. The music grew louder again, more insistent. Tommy wove together elements of flamenco guitar, the rapid-fire fingerwork he'd learned from YouTube videos and obsessive practice. Then he merged it with rock techniques, bending strings until they screamed, using vibrato that made each note shimmer and pulse with life. This was the anger part, the frustration of watching less talented people succeed, because they knew the right people or had the right look. The bitterness of standing in the wings while musicians he'd taught techniques to took bows for performances he'd made possible. Every time someone had walked past him like he was part of the furniture. Every time his skill had gone unnoticed because he wasn't standing in the spotlight. But there was also joy in the music. The pure, simple pleasure of making something beautiful. The meditative state he entered when his fingers found the strings at 3 a.m, when the rest of the world was asleep and it was just him and the guitar and the music that lived inside his head. The moments when everything clicked, when his hands did exactly what he imagined, when the notes that came out matched the ones he heard in his mind. Tommy built toward something bigger now. His whole body moved with the instrument, swaying, his fingers working independently like they belonged to different people. He combined everything, all the styles, all the techniques, all the emotion. Classical precision met rock and roll abandon. Technical mastery merged with raw feeling. The room had gone completely silent except for the guitar. No one was laughing now. No one was checking their phones. Even Derek's friends had lowered their devices, just watching. Their expressions transformed from mockery to something like awe. Tommy's fingers flew through a final series of runs, each one more complex than the last. He hit harmonics that rang out like crystal, bent notes that sounded like they were crying, tapped out rhythms that created their own percussion. The music swelled, reaching a peak that felt like standing on top of a mountain and screaming into the wind. Then he found one final chord. Not the single chord Derek had mockingly asked for, but a full-handed chord that used every string, every finger, creating a sound so rich and complete it seemed to fill every corner of the venue. He let it ring out, sustaining it, adding vibrato that made it pulse like a heartbeat. The note hung in the air, beautiful and defiant and impossible to ignore. Tommy held it until the natural sustain began to fade, then brought his hand down slowly, muting the strings. The silence that followed was profound. Not the awkward quiet of before, but something else. Something heavy with unspoken words. Tommy opened his eyes. His hands were shaking slightly, adrenaline flooding his system. He'd never played for an audience before. Not a real one. And he'd certainly never poured out everything he had all at once, holding nothing back. Derek Stone was standing now. His bourbon glass sat forgotten on the table, amber liquid untouched. His face had gone pale under his tan. He ran a hand through his styled hair, messing it up, looking genuinely shaken. The room remained frozen. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They were all processing what they'd just witnessed, trying to reconcile the invisible equipment guy with the musician who'd just played like his life depended on it. Because in a way, it had. Tommy realized that now. He'd been dying slowly for 15 years, suffocating his talent, convincing himself that safety was better than risk. That being invisible was easier than being seen and possibly rejected. But something about Derek's casual cruelty, about watching that folk singer's dreams get crushed without a second thought, had broken something inside him. Or maybe it had finally fixed something that had been broken for a long time. Derek took a step forward, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to find words that wouldn't come. His expression was completely different now. The arrogance was gone. The smug superiority had evaporated. What remained was something raw and honest. What was that? Derek's voice came out barely above a whisper. What the hell was that? Tommy lowered the guitar carefully, his fingers still tingling from the performance. The question hung in the air between them. What was that? He looked at Derek Stone, really looked at him, and saw something he hadn't expected. The rock star wasn't angry or defensive. He looked genuinely rattled, like someone had just pulled the floor out from under him. 15 years, Tommy said quietly. His voice sounded rough, unused to being the center of attention. That's what that was. Derek blinked, trying to process. 15 years of what? Of watching. Of learning. Of practicing in empty rooms where nobody could hear me fail. Tommy set the guitar back on its stand with the same care he'd shown it earlier. Professional habits ran deep. Of telling myself that someday I'd be ready. That someday I'd be good enough. The woman who'd been crying spoke up from her seat. You've been working as a tech this whole time? With that kind of talent? Her voice was thick with emotion, disbelief coloring every word. Tommy nodded. He felt exposed now, vulnerable in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Playing the music had been the easy part, weirdly enough. Talking about it about himself, that was harder. It paid the bills. And honestly, I think I was hiding. It's easier to be invisible than to put yourself out there and risk failing. Derek's manager, a sharp-looking woman in her 40s who'd been silent until now, pulled out her phone and started typing furiously. I recorded the whole thing, she said without looking up. This is incredible. Do you know how many views this could get? The story alone is marketing gold. Unknown tech guy shows up, famous producer, reveals hidden genius. Wait, you recorded it? Tommy felt his stomach drop. That hadn't occurred to him. He'd been so caught up in the moment, in finally letting go of everything he'd been holding back, that he hadn't thought about consequences. About what came next, of course I did. She looked up now, her eyes sharp and calculating. This is the kind of content people lose their minds over. Real talent, real emotion, underdog story. It's perfect. Derek held up a hand, silencing her. He was still staring at Tommy with that same shaken expression. I've been doing this for 20 years, he said slowly. I've auditioned thousands of musicians, signed dozens, worked with some of the biggest names in the industry. He paused, seeming to struggle with what he wanted to say. And I've never heard anything like what you just played. One of Derek's friends, the guy in the expensive leather jacket who'd made the race car driver joke earlier, whistled low. Man, that was intense. Like legitimately incredible. Where did you even learn to play like that? Everywhere, Tommy said. From every musician I've worked with. Every technique I've seen. Every song I've heard. I absorbed it all like a sponge for 15 years. Took it home and pracked. Iced until my fingers bled. He flexed his hands unconsciously, remembering countless nights of repetition, building calluses on top of calluses. Derek walked closer, and Tommy noticed his swagger was gone. He moved differently now, with less performance, more authenticity. The offer I made, I meant it as a joke. I'm not proud of that. He glanced back at his entourage at the empty stage where he'd dismissed so many hopeful musicians. I've been cruel tonight. Hell, I've been cruel at a lot of these showcases. It's easy to forget that every person up there has dreams, has worked hard, has something they're trying to say. Yeah, Tommy said simply. There wasn't much else to say to that. But the offer stands, Derek continued, and this time his voice was serious. Forget the joke. That was real talent, real artistry. I want to sign you. Right now, tonight. My label can make you a star." The room erupted in overlapping voices. Derek's manager was already pulling up contract templates on her tablet. His friends were talking about social media strategy, about how to break the story. Someone mentioned calling a music journalist they knew. The energy in the room had completely transformed from mocking to excited. Everyone suddenly wanting to be part of whatever this was turning into. Tommy felt like he was underwater, all the voices muffled and distant. This was it, the moment he'd fantasized about for years. A real record deal, with a legitimate label, offered by someone who actually understood what he could do. It was everything he'd wanted when he was 17, when he'd first picked up a guitar and felt the electricity of possibility run through him. So why did he feel so strange about it? "Can I ask you something?" Tommy said, and the room quieted down. Derek nodded. "That folk singer, the one who opened tonight, what was wrong with her performance?" Derek frowned, clearly not expecting the question. "What do you mean? You cut her off after barely a minute. Didn't even let her finish. What did she do wrong?" Derek shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know. It just wasn't what I was looking for. Wrong vibe, maybe. The market's saturated with that kind of sound." "She was good, though," Tommy pressed. "Really good." Her voice was clear, her lyrics were honest. She'd clearly worked hard on that song, but you dismissed her without really listening. "Where are you going with this?" Derek's defensiveness was creeping back into his voice. Tommy looked around the room at all these industry people, at their expensive clothes and their casual confidence. "I spent 15 years being invisible, watching talented people get rejected for arbitrary reasons, watching connections matter more than skill, watching image trump substance over and over again." He turned back to Derek. "And yeah, you're offering me a deal now. But why? Because I'm actually talented or because I gave you a good story? Because I'm the tech guy who could play and that's marketable?" The manager spoke up, her voice smooth and professional. "Does it matter? Talent and story aren't mutually exclusive. People connect with narratives. That's not a bad thing." "Maybe not," Tommy admitted. "But here's what I'm realizing. For 15 years, I told myself I was waiting for the right moment, for someone to discover me, to give me permission to be a musician. I convinced myself I needed validation from people like you." He gestured around the room. "But watching you all tonight, seeing how this industry actually works, I'm not sure I want that validation anymore." Derek's expression hardened. "You're turning down a record deal. Do you have any idea how many people would kill for this opportunity?" "I know exactly how many," Tommy said. "I saw a bunch of them tonight, and you crushed most of their dreams before they finished a song." He felt a strange calm settling over him. The shaking in his hands had stopped. "Don't get me wrong, I'm grateful. Really. You pushed me to do something I should have done years ago. You made me stop hiding. But I don't need your label. I don't need you to make me a musician. I already am one. I have been for 15 years. I just forgot." The woman who'd been crying earlier stood up. "Can I say something?" Everyone turned to look at her. She wiped her eyes, smearing her makeup. "I work in A&R for Derek. It's my job to find talent. And I've never, in 8 years of doing this, seen someone turn down an opportunity like this. But I also haven't seen someone stand up for their principles like you just did. For what it's worth, I think you're making the right choice." Derek looked at her, surprised. "You're supposed to be on my side." "I am," she said. "But he's right. We've been cruel tonight. We're cruel at most of these showcases. We've forgotten what it's like to be the person on stage, vulnerable and hoping for a chance." She turned to Tommy. "What are you going to do, if you don't take the deal?" Tommy smiled for the first time since he'd picked up the guitar. It felt good, natural. "I've got 15 years of music in my head. Songs I've written, melodies I've composed, ideas I've never shared. I think it's time I stopped being afraid to share them." "How?" Derek asked. He didn't sound challenging anymore, just curious. "However I want," Tommy said. "Maybe I'll post videos online. Maybe I'll play small venues. Maybe I'll record an album in my apartment on equipment I buy myself. The point is, it'll be mine. My music, my terms, my timeline. No one else's." Derek's manager held up her phone. "The video I took is already getting traction. I posted it in a few industry groups while you were talking. You've got talent scouts asking who you are." "Then I guess they'll find out," Tommy said. He picked up his toolbox, suddenly wanting to leave before he second-guessed himself. "Thanks for tonight, seriously." but I'm done being backstage." He walked toward the exit, his heart pounding but his steps steady. Behind him, the room erupted in conversation again, everyone processing what had just happened. But Tommy didn't look back. For the first time in 15 years, he was walking toward something instead of away from it. Tommy's apartment was exactly what you'd expect from a guitar tech who spent most of his money on equipment instead of furniture. A futon that had seen better days, a small kitchen table with mismatched chairs, and one entire wall dedicated to guitars, amplifiers, and recording gear he'd collected over the years. It wasn't much, but it was his. He set his toolbox down by the door and collapsed onto the futon, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried him through the showcase and out of the venue was wearing off, leaving him feeling hollow and shaky. His phone buzzed in his pocket, then buzzed again. And again, against his better judgment, he pulled it out. 17 missed calls, 43 text messages. Most were from numbers he didn't recognize. A few were from other techs he worked with, asking if the video everyone was talking about was really him. One was from his mom, who somehow already knew something had happened and wanted to make sure he was okay. The video. Right. Derek's manager had recorded the whole thing and apparently posted it somewhere. Tommy's thumb hovered over his social media apps, but he couldn't bring himself to open them yet. He wasn't ready to see himself through other people's eyes. Instead, he stood up and walked to his recording corner. It wasn't fancy. Just a decent audio interface, a used microphone, and some software he'd learned to use through YouTube tutorials. But it was enough. It had always been enough. He just hadn't trusted it to be. Tommy picked up his own guitar, a beat-up acoustic he'd owned since he was 19. It had scratches and dents from years of use, the finish worn down where his arm rested against it. He sat down and started playing, not anything specific, just letting his fingers wander. This was how he processed things, how he thought through problems. The music helped him find clarity. His phone rang. He ignored it. It rang again. On the third call, he glanced at the screen. It was Vincent, an old session musician who'd taken Tommy under his wing years ago. Vincent was one of the few people in the industry Tommy actually respected. He answered. "You've been busy." Vincent's gravelly voice came through the speaker. The old man didn't waste time on small talk. "You saw it already?" Tommy asked. "Everyone's seen it. It's got 50,000 views and climbing. People are losing their minds trying to figure out who you are." Vincent paused. "That was you playing, right? Not some trick?" "It was me." "Well, hell." Vincent let out a low whistle. "I knew you could play, kid. Heard you messing around at that session 3 years ago, but that was something else. Where'd you learn to tap like that?" "Practice. A lot of it." "Too much, probably," Vincent laughed. "No such thing as too much practice. So what happens now? I heard Derek Stone offered you a deal and you walked away. That true?" Tommy leaned back against the wall. "Yeah, that's true." "Good." "Good?" Tommy hadn't expected that response. Derek Stone's label would have chewed you up and spit you out. They'd have wanted to control everything, your image, your sound, your message. You'd be rich, sure, famous maybe, but you wouldn't be you anymore. Vincent coughed, that rough smoker's cough he'd had for as long as Tommy had known him. "You made the right call. Hard call, but right. I'm terrified I made a mistake," Tommy admitted. "That was my shot. What if nothing else happens? What if this is as good as it gets?" "Then it still gets pretty good," Vincent said. "You finally played for people. You finally showed them what you can do. That video's out there now. Can't take it back. The question is, what are you going to do with it?" Tommy looked around his small apartment, at his modest collection of gear, at the guitar in his hands. "I don't know. I've spent so long hiding, I'm not even sure what not hiding looks like. Start small. Record something. One song, post it yourself. See what happens. You've got people's attention now, might as well use it." Vincent paused. "And kid, stop waiting for permission. You don't need it." They talked for a few more minutes before Vincent had to go. Tommy sat there for a while after hanging up, turning the old man's words over in his mind. Start small, one song. He could do that. He'd written dozens of songs over the years, kept them in notebooks and voice memos on his phone, never intending for anyone to hear them. His phone buzzed again. This time it was an email. The subject line made him pause. From the folk singer at the Viper Room. Tommy opened it. The message was short. "I don't know if you'll read this, but I wanted to say thank you. Watching you stand up for yourself tonight, seeing you turn down that deal because you knew your worth, it meant something to me. Derek Stone crushed me tonight. I was ready to give up on music completely. But if you can be brave enough to claim your talent after 15 years, maybe I can be brave enough to keep trying. You reminded me why I started writing songs in the first place. So thank you. Keep playing. The world needs to hear it. Tommy read it 3 times. He'd been so focused on his own journey, his own fears and choices, that he hadn't considered how it might affect anyone else. The folk singer had been devastated, ready to quit. And somehow watching him find his courage had helped her find hers. Maybe Vincent was right. Maybe it was time to stop waiting. Tommy spent the next 6 hours recording. He picked one of his oldest songs, something he'd written when he was 22, and still believed anything was possible. The lyrics were rough, honest about feeling invisible in a world that seemed to only value flash and performance. He'd never intended anyone to hear it, which somehow made it easier to record now. There was nothing to prove, nothing to lose. It was just him and the song. He kept the production simple. Just his guitar and his voice. No fancy effects, no studio tricks. Raw and real. When he finished mixing it at 4 in the morning, he listened to it twice through his headphones. It wasn't perfect. His voice cracked a little on the second verse. There was a slight buzz in one of the guitar lines he probably should have fixed. But it was honest. It was him. Before he could overthink it, he uploaded the song to every platform he could think of. YouTube, social media, streaming services. He wrote a simple description. This is who I am. This is what I've been hiding. No more. Then he collapsed onto his futon and fell asleep immediately, his phone still in his hand. When Tommy woke up 8 hours later, his phone was going crazy. The song had been shared thousands of times. Comments flooded in from people who'd seen the showcase video and wanted more. Music blogs were writing articles. A few smaller labels had sent emails. But more importantly, regular people were connecting with the music. They were sharing their own stories of hiding their talents, of being afraid, of finally finding courage. One comment stood out. It was from someone who worked at a small venue downtown. We'd love to have you play here, next Friday. No pressure, just you and your guitar. If you're ready to stop hiding, we've got a stage. Tommy stared at that message for a long time. A real show, in front of real people, not in his apartment, not in empty rehearsal spaces, actually performing, claiming space as a musician instead of as the invisible guy who made sure the equipment worked. His hands started shaking again, but this time it felt different. Not fear exactly, more like anticipation, like standing at the edge of something vast and unknown, ready to jump. He typed out a response before he could talk himself out of it. I'll be there. 3 days later, Derek Stone's manager called him. Tommy almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of him. I'm not calling to offer you a deal, she said immediately. I'm calling to apologize, and to ask if you'd be willing to collaborate with Derek on one track. Just one. No strings attached, no contract, no label involvement. He wants to work with you as a musician, not as someone to sign. Why? Tommy asked. Because you humbled him. Because watching you walk away made him realize he'd forgotten what music was supposed to be about. And honestly, because your song is really good and he respects what you're doing. She paused. He's not a bad person. He just got lost somewhere along the way. We all did. Tommy thought about it. Part of him wanted to say no, to keep his distance from that whole world. But another part remembered Derek's face when he'd been playing, the genuine shock and respect. Maybe people could change. Maybe bridges didn't have to stay burned. One song, Tommy said. On my terms. On your terms, she agreed. When Friday came, Tommy arrived at the small venue 3 hours early. He needed time to set up his own equipment, to get comfortable with the space, to quiet the voice in his head that kept saying he wasn't ready for this. The venue held maybe 200 people, nothing compared to the stadiums he'd worked in as a tech. But somehow it felt bigger. People started arriving around 7. Tommy watched from backstage, his guitar in his hands, his heart pounding. He recognized a few faces from the showcase video comments. Others were clearly curious, drawn by the story of the guitar tech who could really play. By the time the lights went down, the room was packed. The owner of the venue walked on stage and gave a simple introduction. This is someone who's been making music in the shadows for 15 years. Tonight he steps into the light. Please welcome Tommy Rivera. Tommy walked out onto the stage. The spotlight hit him, warm and bright. For just a second, he froze. This was it. This was real. No more hiding. No more pretending he was content to be invisible. Then he found his spot center stage, adjusted his guitar, and looked out at all those faces looking back at him, waiting. He smiled. And he began to play. The first note came out clear and strong, cutting through the silence of the packed venue. Tommy felt his nerves settle as his fingers found their rhythm. This was different from playing at the showcase. That had been about breaking free, about finally releasing everything he'd kept bottled up. This was about connection, about sharing his music with people who'd chosen to be here. He played the song he'd recorded, the one about being invisible. But it sounded different live, more raw somehow. His voice carried emotion that hadn't quite come through in the recording. When he got to the chorus, he heard a few people in the audience singing along quietly. They'd learned the words from his upload. That realization almost made him miss a chord change. The song ended and the applause hit him like a physical force. It wasn't polite clapping. It was genuine, enthusiastic people cheering and whistling. Someone in the back shouted, "More!" and others picked it up until it became a chant. Tommy laughed, a sound of pure relief and joy. Okay, he said into the microphone. I've got more. I've got 15 years of more. He played for 90 minutes straight, working through songs he'd written across different periods of his life. There was the angry one from his mid-20s, when rejection letters had piled up and he'd almost given up completely. There was the hopeful one from 3 years ago, when he'd briefly convinced himself that maybe things could change. There was a new one he'd finished just 2 days ago, about taking the leap and not knowing where you'd land. Between songs, he talked to the audience. Not rehearsed banter, just honest thoughts about his journey. He told them about working as a tech, about learning from every musician he'd met, about the night at the Viper Room that had changed everything. People listened like his story mattered because to them it did. It was a story about courage they recognized in themselves or wished they had. Near the end of the set, Tommy paused. There's someone here tonight I want to acknowledge, he said, scanning the crowd. The folk singer from the showcase, the one who got cut off. I don't know if you came, but if you did, I hope you know that your performance that night was beautiful. You deserved better than what you got. Movement near the side of the stage caught his eye. The young woman from the showcase stepped forward, raising her hand shyly. The audience erupted in applause and Tommy gestured for her to come up. She hesitated, then climbed the stairs to join him. What's your name? Tommy asked her. Riley, she said softly into the microphone. Riley wrote the song that Derek Stone didn't let her finish. I think we should hear it now. What do you say? He looked at the audience, who cheered their agreement. Riley's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. Tommy handed her his guitar and stepped back, giving her the spotlight. Her hands shook as she positioned the instrument, but when she started playing, her voice was steady. The song was about chasing dreams even when the world tells you to give up. It was simple, honest, and absolutely beautiful. When she finished, the applause was deafening. Riley wiped her eyes, laughing and crying at the same time. Tommy came back to the microphone and put a hand on her shoulder. That's how it's supposed to be, he said. Everyone gets to finish their song. After the show, Tommy stayed for 2 hours talking to people. Some wanted advice about their own music. Others just wanted to share their stories about feeling invisible in their own lives. A few asked for autographs, which felt surreal. He was just a guitar tech, except he wasn't anymore, was he? An older gentleman waited until most of the crowd had cleared before approaching. He had kind eyes and a weathered face that spoke of decades in the music business. That was something special, he said, extending his hand. I'm Richard Chen. I run a small independent label here in town. Very small. We work with about 6 artists, help them record and distribute on their own terms. No big contracts, no corporate nonsense. Just good music. Tommy shook his hand, immediately cautious. I'm not looking for a label deal. I know, Richard said with a smile. I read about what happened at the showcase. Smart move walking away from that. But what I'm offering isn't a traditional deal. Think of it more as a partnership. You keep full creative control, own all your music. We just provide resources, studio time, connections to venues, help with the technical side of releasing music professionally. You're clearly talented at playing, but the business side can be overwhelming. Why would you do that? Tommy asked. What's in it for you? Honestly, 10% of sales if you agree. But mainly I love music. Real music made by real people for real reasons. Not manufactured stuff designed by committee. Richard pulled out a business card. Think about it. No pressure. But if you want help navigating this new path you're on, we're here. Tommy took the card, studying it. No flashy design, just a name and number.
Can I ask you something?
That folk singer, Riley. She's really talented. Would you work with her too? Richard's smile widened. Already gave her my card. She's got something special. You both do. Over the next 3 months, Tommy's life transformed in ways he'd never imagined. He released 5 more songs, each one connecting with more people than the last. The collaboration with Derek Stone happened. A track that blended both their styles and raised money for music education programs in underfunded schools. Derek had been different in the studio, less performative, more genuine. They'd never be best friends, but there was mutual respect there now. Tommy took Richard up on his offer, and the small label helped him navigate the complicated world of music distribution and copyright. More importantly, they connected him with other independent artists who became friends and collaborators. Riley was one of them. They'd started writing songs together, her lyrics and his melodies creating something neither could have made alone. He still took tech jobs occasionally, but only for artists he believed in. It kept him grounded, reminded him where he came from. Plus, he genuinely enjoyed the technical side of music production. The difference was that now it was a choice, not a hiding place. The showcase video had surpassed 2 million views. Occasionally, Tommy would read the comments. Most were positive, people inspired by the story. Some criticized his decision to turn down Derek's offer, calling it foolish. He'd learned to let those roll off. You couldn't please everyone, and trying to would just make you invisible again. 6 months after that night at the Viper Room, Tommy was invited back. Not as a tech this time, but as a performer. The venue was hosting a showcase for independent artists, real talent given real time to perform complete sets. Derek Stone would be there, not as a judge, but as an audience member. Tommy arrived early, a habit he couldn't break. He found himself backstage in the same spot where he'd tuned guitars half a year ago. The irony wasn't lost on him. A young tech was working the equipment now, a kid who couldn't have been more than 22. Tommy watched him work with the same careful attention to detail he'd once brought to the job. "First big showcase?" Tommy asked. The kid looked up, startled, then his eyes widened with recognition. "Yeah, I'm pretty nervous. Lots of important people out there tonight." He paused. "Hey, you're Tommy Rivera, the guitar tech who became a musician. Just a musician who happened to be a guitar tech first," Tommy corrected gently. "You play?" The kid nodded, looking embarrassed. "A little. Nothing serious. I mostly just do this, the tech work. It's steady money." Tommy smiled, seeing himself in this kid's cautious words. "Can I give you some advice? Don't wait 15 years to share your music like I did. If you've got something to say it. The world's too short to spend it hiding." "But what if I'm not good enough?" the kid asked quietly. "Good enough for who? The label executives? The critics? The industry gatekeepers?" Tommy shook his head. "The only person you need to be good enough for is yourself. And the people who connect with your music, they'll find you if you let them." The kid thought about that, then nodded slowly. "Thanks, that means a lot." Tommy performed that night to a packed house. He played his newest song, one he'd finished just that morning. It was about transformation, about the courage it takes to stop being who people expect you to be and start being who you actually are. As he played, he saw faces in the crowd experiencing their own recognition, their own moment of realizing that maybe, just maybe, they could be brave too. When he finished his set and walked off stage, Derek was waiting in the wings. They'd talked a few times since their collaboration, usually about music, but occasionally about other things. Derek had been working on himself, trying to be less of the arrogant rock star and more of just a person who loved making music. "Good set," Derek said simply. "Thanks. Good crowd." They stood there for a moment in comfortable silence, two musicians who'd each learned something important from their encounter. "You know what the weirdest part is?" Derek said finally. "I've made millions from music. I've got platinum records and awards and all the stuff I thought mattered. But watching you up there, seeing how much your music means to people, I realized I haven't felt that kind of connection in years. Maybe ever." "It's not too late," Tommy said, "to reconnect with why you started." Derek smiled, a real smile without the performance. "Yeah, maybe it's not." Tommy went home that night to his small apartment, which hadn't changed much despite his growing success. He'd bought some new recording equipment and a few more guitars, but mostly it was the same. He liked it that way. It reminded him that happiness wasn't about the size of your space or the number of your followers. It was about doing what you loved, sharing it honestly and connecting with people who understood. He picked up his beat-up acoustic guitar, the one he'd owned since he was 19. His phone buzzed with messages, opportunities, people wanting pieces of his time and attention. He'd answer them later. Right now, there was a melody in his head that needed to come out. Tommy closed his eyes and started to play. Not for an audience this time, not for views or streams or sales, just for himself, for the pure joy of making music. Because after everything, after the viral video and the shows and the recognition, that was still what mattered most. The music filled his small apartment, spilling out through the open window into the night. Somewhere out there, someone might hear it and feel a little less alone. Someone might find the courage to stop hiding their own gifts. And that, Tommy thought as his fingers danced across the strings, was worth more than any record deal ever could be.